that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king without the help and support of the woman I love.
The royal family stands as a symbol of tradition, stability, and continuity. But behind the ceremony and public spectacle lies a world of rivalry, betrayal, and personal conflict. Because where power, love, and ambition collide, conflict is never far behind.
It's extraordinary when you think about it, that 1 year saw 3 kings of England.
For years, the story has been told of 2 brothers divided by duty and crown.
This was a great moment of crisis for the nation.
The public just could not believe that their king was going to forsake them.
But was the conflict really as clear-cut as history suggests? Or has the truth been blurred by loyalty, reputation, and the passage of time? In June 1911, Britain crowned a new king. The coronation of George V was one of the great spectacles of the age, a celebration not only of a monarch, but of an empire at the height of its power. For the House of Windsor, the future appeared secure. Standing beside the new king was his eldest son, Prince Edward.
Growing up, Edward was a different kind of royal to what had come before. He knew that there was increased media attention focusing on him, also what was going on in terms of his private life, and he knew he had a role to play that he was expected to perform. He was a lively, excitable young person, driven by change, interested in new things. He saw the 20th century as this great opportunity, and in that respect, very different from what had come before.
Well, George V was very different because he was a much more traditional figure. He was somebody who was much more interested in maintaining the integrity of a monarchy. He was somebody who essentially saw himself almost like Queen Victoria again, somebody who was going to come in and take this institution that was beginning to fall into disrepute and essentially make it great again. But what he was he wasn't a dynamic figure. I mean, he's often been called the most boring king ever to have ruled England. So I suppose that we look at George V as somebody now who, because he wasn't this dynamic figure, he was in his own way somebody who did bring about change, but the change was that of stability.
As heir to the crown, Edward quickly became one of the most recognisable figures in Britain. Crowds flocked to see him. Newspapers followed his every move, and many believed he represented a more modern face of monarchy.
So unlike his father, Edward loved the modern world. He loved cars, American automobiles, he loved jazz clubs, he loved nightclubs. So he definitely was a rule breaker. He wanted to push against the boundaries of convention. He followed his heart over his head. He was the antithesis of the emotionally contained, royal, dutiful king or heir apparent.
Yet behind the public enthusiasm, concerns were already emerging. Edward enjoyed the privileges of royal life far more than its obligations. While he excelled at public appearances and overseas tours, he showed little enthusiasm for the routine duties and constitutional responsibilities that accompanied his position. The contrast with his father could hardly have been greater.
King George V had quite a strained relationship, certainly with his sons. He was quite an old-fashioned figure. He was very much a Victorian. He was quite backward-looking and at first quite resistant to the change brought about by things like new technologies and developments in the mass media. His children, and particularly his sons, they lived very different lives to their father, and for that reason there were tensions.
George V believed monarchy depended upon discipline, restraint, and an unwavering sense of duty. Edward often appeared impatient with the restrictions royal life imposed upon him.
I think it's fair to say that Prince Edward hated his father. I think it's fair to say that he despised him for being this anachronistic, stuffy figure, and that he absolutely despised the idea that his father had been pushing him into this unsuitable garment, if you like, and that the garment of monarchy did not fit very well with him. He was a man who preferred dressing up in Savile Row suits to ceremonial robes. So I think that his loathing of his father was something that stayed with him all his life.
As the years passed, the relationship between father and son became increasingly strained. Despite his popularity, Edward's private life frequently attracted criticism. His relationships, social circle, and reluctance to conform to royal expectations worried both his family and senior figures within the establishment.
He was actually very like Diana in that sense, that the people adored him, the establishment thought otherwise.
Yet there was never any question about who would inherit the throne. When George V died in January 1936, Edward became Edward VIII. At last, the role he had been born to fulfill was his. But was it really a role he wanted at all? For a man who had spent much of his life resisting the demands of monarchy, the throne he had now inherited would force an impossible choice. And when that choice came, it would not only alter the course of his own life, it would transform the life of the younger brother who had spent decades assuming he would never be king. If Edward was raised to stand at the centre of royal life, his younger brother occupied a very different position. Born Prince Albert in 1895, he grew up in the shadow of an elder brother whose future seemed certain. From an early age, the path before him appeared straightforward. Edward would become king. Albert would support him. The two brothers could hardly have been more different.
George VI was the opposite of his brother Edward growing up. He was Albert, he was known as Bertie. He was shy, he was retiring, while his brother was outgoing and gregarious. He had no particular interest in fashion, no particular interest in chasing after women, although his brother encouraged him in doing so. But as a character, he was a much less likely king than Edward ever was, because he was somebody who didn't seem to be very comfortable around people.
Where Edward was confident and outgoing, Albert was shy and reserved. He struggled with a severe stammer that made public speaking an ordeal and was often uncomfortable in the spotlight.
George's character was marked by the fact that he didn't have a great deal of confidence. And the reason why he didn't have a great deal of confidence was because he had a stammer. Now, psychologists have sought to try and explain the stammer in relation to the fraught relationship that the royal children had with the king, with their father, George V, growing up, and that the young Bertie growing up had been almost terrified by his father and the expectations that his father had imposed on him.
The brothers shared the same parents, the same upbringing, and the same royal world. Yet the paths laid out for them from childhood were fundamentally different. Edward grew up knowing he would one day be king. Albert grew up knowing he almost certainly would not. And it was those different expectations that helped shape two very different men.
He was much more similar to George V in terms of temperament and in terms of character than his brother was. He believed in duty. He believed, but essentially he agreed with George V that the monarchy had to be maintained by any means possible, and that the best means of maintaining the monarchy was to accede to any conventional ideas of duty. His brother did not agree with this.
The attention that Edward seemed to enjoy was something Albert frequently tried to avoid. As the years passed, those differences only became more apparent. While Edward emerged as one of the most famous men in the country, Albert quietly devoted himself to duty. He served in the Royal Navy during the First World War and gradually took on a growing number of royal engagements, carrying them out with little of the glamour that surrounded his elder brother.
He was not somebody who was seeking the limelight. He was not somebody who wanted to have his name up in lights. He was somebody who would have much preferred a quiet, simple family life.
In 1923, Albert married Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. The marriage would prove to be one of the most important relationships of his life. Together they built a stable family home and welcomed 2 daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret. In contrast to Edward's often turbulent private life, Albert's family life offered a sense of security and permanence.
Bertie found his closest confidant and greatest supporter in his wife, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. After a number of unsuccessful attempts to woo her and propose marriage to her, she eventually consented and agreed to marry him. There was some talk at the time about whether she was in fact more interested in his older brother, Edward, Prince of Wales, and that was one of the reasons why she originally turned Bertie down. Nevertheless, she would get married to Bertie. They would become the Duke and Duchess of York, and really they embodied everything that was best about the monarchy in this period, in that they presented themselves as very dutiful figures. They went out into public life, they toured towns and cities, they opened hospitals, they did all that was expected of royals of their generation.
I mean, it's incredibly lovely, the relationship between Bertie, Elizabeth, and the 2 daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret, us 4. They were a wonderfully tight unit, and I think that the Queen Mother and Bertie were, as good as parents as they could be given their constraints.
At this stage, Albert's focus was on his wife, his daughters, and the life they were building together. As second son to the king, he had no expectation of inheriting the throne. For much of his life, that arrangement appeared unlikely to change. But while Albert embraced the responsibilities that came with royal life, events were already unfolding that would challenge everything he thought he knew about his future. By the time Edward became king in January 1936, one relationship was already causing concern among those closest to the crown. For several years, he had grown increasingly attached to an American socialite named Wallis Simpson.
Wallis and Edward first met at a house party in Melton Mowbray in Leicestershire, and I think the sense that you get is that Edward is sort of in awe of a woman who refuses to placate him and kowtow to him in the way, the sort of rather nauseatingly, sucking up way that the rest of the British society would have done, that Wallis was very much her own woman. And of course she was intrigued by the Prince of Wales and incredibly flattered as she became involved in his milieu. But in her mind, this was just a sort of frisson, a flirtation, a bit of fun, and she was firmly married to her second husband, Ernest Simpson.
What is quite clear is that their first encounter, which would have been in either the late 20s or the early 1930s, was not wildly auspicious. It wasn't as if the 2 of them met across a crowded room and immediately fell in love. But what Wallis did was to insinuate herself into a social circle, slowly and gradually, and she made sure that every time that she met the Prince of Wales that she was always there, she was always first with a cocktail, first with a joke, first with some memorable line. And so gradually she was able to say later in life, we had crossed that step that separates friendship from love. So I think that she very much set her cap at him. I don't think he had any particular concept of her, but I think that it's always flattering for somebody to be after you to that extent, and I think that she succeeded very well.
Wallis was vivacious, intelligent, charming, she was sharp-witted, and she didn't suffer fools. I think one of the reasons why Edward became so enamored with her was that she never talked up to him. She never saw him as a superior. She saw him as an equal, and he liked the fact that she had this kind of democratic persona where she treated everybody equally.
As time went by, the two became closer, beginning an affair. To Edward, she was a trusted companion whose wit and confidence offered an escape from the constraints of royal life. But within government circles, the royal household and the Church of England, the relationship was viewed very differently. Wallis was married when the couple first met and, by 1936, was pursuing a second divorce. The prospect of a reigning monarch marrying a twice-divorced woman raised profound constitutional and religious questions.
Well, in the upper classes in Britain in the early 1930s, it was considered rather fashionable to keep a mistress. And so the fact that Edward, as the greatest man of fashion of them all, was involved with a married woman was in no sense remarkable. What surprised people was, first of all, that she was American, which was seen as vulgar. Secondly, that she didn't come from a grand family, but was the daughter of a Baltimore boarding house proprietor. And thirdly, the fact that he seemed to be completely and utterly besotted by her, because Edward was very unusual in that he wasn't a married man. I mean, usually kings were married and it was just a given that you would have a wife who would become queen and children. But Edward had none of this, which of course led to rumours about sexual dysfunction. And Wallis, for whatever reason, was this figure who she'd ingratiated herself in higher society. She'd hosted many dinner parties and lunch parties. One guest said Wallis's parties have so much pep you never want to leave. And I think what's interesting is that the wider public knew nothing about this, even though Edward was quite happy to flaunt her in public and was always seen around with her very much as his official companion.
As rumours about the relationship spread, concern began to turn into alarm. Many hoped Edward would put duty before personal desire.
Edward always knew that abdication was a possibility. There was a lot of pressure on Edward to either give up the throne in order to marry the woman he loved or give up Wallis Simpson. And that pressure came from, notably, Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, representative of course, the British nation, but also of the Commonwealth governments as well. There was also a lot of pressure coming from Cosmo Lang, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who advised both Baldwin and Edward that it would be very unbecoming for Edward to stay on the throne and marry this woman who was twice divorced.
The situation placed enormous pressure on the royal family. For George, the issue was no longer simply a matter of his brother's private life. It was becoming a question of the monarchy's future. As the months passed, the distance between the two brothers grew. Edward believed he should be free to follow his heart. George believed that, as king, some responsibilities could not be set aside. Neither man yet knew where the crisis would lead. But the disagreement that was emerging behind palace walls would soon become one of the greatest constitutional dramas in modern British history. By the autumn of 1936, the crisis surrounding Edward and Wallis Simpson had reached breaking point. The government would not support the marriage. The church opposed it. Many within the royal family hoped Edward would abandon the relationship and put the crown first.
Edward wanted to abdicate. He hated being king. It was one of the things he found easiest in his life. The problem is that what he found and what the people around him found was you can't simply unilaterally abdicate. It isn't as easy as just saying, I don't want to be king anymore and stopping being king, because it's not a job, it's a whole responsibility, not just to yourself, but to the nation.
For Edward, the choice was deeply personal. He believed he was being asked to sacrifice the woman he loved in order to satisfy an institution he had never felt entirely comfortable within.
In one sense, it wasn't a difficult decision at all, because the thing that he was most clear about was that he could not be an effective king without the support of the woman he loved, and that this relationship meant more to him than anything.
For George, the situation looked very different. The monarchy depended upon duty, restraint, and compromise. To him, kingship was not a privilege to be enjoyed, but an obligation to be accepted. The brothers were viewing the same crisis through entirely different lenses.
He didn't feel that he had the wherewithal to be king. He was the absolute antithesis of his brother. His brother was sophisticated, glamorous, dashing, confident, good with people. Here was Bertie, anxious, stuttering. You know, you couldn't have a greater contrast. So he begged Edward not to abdicate. He said, please, don't do this to me. He went to see his brother at Fort Belvedere the night before the abdication, and the whole family were in complete and utter shock.
On December 10th, 1936, Edward signed the instrument of abdication. Less than a year after becoming king, he surrendered the throne.
The public reaction to the education was really split. For many members of the British public, especially the British working classes who really had loved Edward, this was a moment of shock and horror. They were really upset that he had given up the throne. They'd been very supportive of him marrying Wallis Simpson and keeping his crown. On the other hand, certainly middle-class sections of British society, which were more conservative, there was a sense there that this was the right thing to do, that he'd made the right decision, and that his brother was better placed to succeed him as king, given that his brother had a happy Christian family life.
The following evening, he explained his decision to the world.
His Royal Highness Prince Edward. At long last, I am able to say a few words of my own. I have never wanted to withhold anything, but until now, it has not been constitutionally possible for me to speak. But you must believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love. And now we all have the new king. I wish him and you, his people, happiness and prosperity with all my heart. God bless you all. God save the king.
Next, His Majesty is to be presented with the Holy Bible. To enable him to receive it, the Lord Great Chamberlain draws off the jeweled glove, after which the Bible can be delivered.
The coronation event took place at the beginning of 1937, and it was essentially what had been planned for his brother. The idea behind the coronation was it would be televised, and it would be the first coronation event that had been televised because it was felt that there should be greater transparency about the workings of such things. But there was enormous fear that George stammering on television would look horrendous, and so the Archbishop made sure that there were various precautions taken so nothing of that sort happened. But in the end, the coronation went absolutely fine, and the thing was that Churchill was watching it with his wife Clementine, and he said after he'd seen the king crowned, you're quite right. It could never have been the other one.
Bertie would take the name George VI specifically in order to associate himself with his father, who had been George V. The connection there in terms of the public image was key. He saw himself very much of a king in the vein of his father, in terms of the values he sought to exemplify as monarch. He was about duty, diligence, behaving constitutionally, in contrast with his brother, Edward. It was also the case, of course, that Bertie, the name deriving from Albert, it's a very German-sounding name. Really, since the end of the First World War, the British royal family had sought to de-Germanize themselves and cut themselves off from their Germanic roots, presenting themselves as a more British family.
The abdication may have resolved the constitutional crisis, but it did little to heal the wounds within the family. George VI inherited a monarchy that had been shaken to its foundations. His first priority was restoring confidence in the crown and proving that the institution remained bigger than any individual.
Obviously, the abdication was utterly shocking and devastating for the British people. I think they trusted in Bertie and Elizabeth, and they just went with it. There wasn't the sense of censor that there is nowadays, or division about the monarchy. I think that the people, rather like the church, they just bowed to authority.
Edward had different concerns. Having given up the throne, he still expected to retain much of the status and privilege that came with it.
Well, what happened immediately after the abdication was that it was decided that Edward could not remain in Britain any longer, because it was felt that having an ex-king in his own country created a situation that was both rife with constitutional issues, but it was also difficult from a perspective of how he would be regarded, because there was always a fear of Edward having a kind of rival court, because there was such public sympathy towards him. But the idea that George VI trying to establish himself as king, but it all being essentially ignored because of the idea that the true king or the former king was still sort of hanging about.
He wanted recognition for the sacrifice he believed he had made. The clash between the brothers quickly became personal. Disputes emerged over money, official roles, and most significantly, the status of Wallis Simpson. George refused to grant her the style of Royal Highness, a decision Edward never fully forgave.
Well, Edward became obsessed after the abdication, with Wallis being referred to as Her Royal Highness, and this was a real bugbear of his. He would bring it up constantly in letters, he'd bring it up at every conceivable opportunity. But the problem was that in British society there was such contempt and disdain for Wallis that nobody wanted to give her any kind of honorific title.
Edward was really frustrated that George VI did not consent to give Wallis the style Her Royal Highness, HRH. He was angry because he thought that this was something that should have naturally been extended to her once Wallis became his wife. It was an ongoing problem, and it was something that was never resolved.
To George, the issue was constitutional. To Edward, it was an insult. Each brother increasingly believed the other had failed to understand his position. One felt abandoned with an unwanted responsibility. The other felt punished for a choice he believed he had every right to make. The foundations of a lasting family rift were now firmly in place.
And you can see that his relationship with George VI, immediately after the abdication crisis, was reasonably civil. But before he got married, the relationship had more or less broken down between the brothers.
On June 3rd, the world waited at the gates of the heavily guarded Chateau de Cannes for the news that the greatest royal courtship of all time had reached its climax, the wedding of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. The ceremony took place in the ancient chateau that symbolized the romance of royalty in the days of old. The Reverend Jardine, the clergyman who defied his superiors to perform the wedding service of the Church of England for his former king, is rushed to the chateau in the car which Edward sent to the station to meet him. Mayor Charles Mercier of Mons, whose civil ceremony actually united the Duke and Duchess, poses with his badge of office, the tricolour sash of France. As the aged gatekeeper toasts the newlyweds, the Duke and Duchess appear to have their wedding pictures taken. Here comes the bride to join Edward in the happiest moment of their lives. The former Baltimore belle wears a gown and jacket of the now famous Wallis blue, a light shade especially designed for her. Like all other newlyweds, they feel a bit self-conscious, with the press recording the wedding of the man who surrendered the greatest throne in the world for the woman of his choice. At 41, she is the popular June bride of the man described for so many years as the world's most eligible bachelor. Now a 43-year-old bridegroom. One final pose with the wedding party before they depart on their honeymoon. And like a prince and princess in storybooks, the world hopes Edward and Wally will live happily ever after.
No senior member of the royal family attended. The absence reflected just how far relations had deteriorated. As Duke of Windsor, Edward began a new life abroad. But exile proved very different from freedom. For much of his life, he had occupied the center of royal attention. Now he found himself watching events from the sidelines. The contrast with his brother could not have been greater. While George VI grew into his role as king, Edward struggled to find a meaningful role for himself.
Now these Bahama Islands, to which I've been appointed governor, have always had very good relations with America. And I sincerely hope that Americans will continue to find rest and pleasure here, despite some changed conditions imposed by hostilities.
Edward felt very slighted to have been given this role of governor of the Bahamas. I mean, you can absolutely understand that you have been King of England, King Emperor, you know, you've ruled over this empire of 500 million people and you're now going to this tiny island in the Bahamas to be the governor. He felt insulted because after the abdication, he always wanted to have a suitable role, a job within England, and he really did fight for that, but you know, that was not going to be granted by the Queen Mother and Tommy Lascelles.
The further George moved towards the heart of the monarchy, the further Edward seemed to drift away from it. Bitterness began to grow. Edward remained convinced that he had been treated unfairly by his family. George, meanwhile, was increasingly frustrated by what he saw as his brother's inability to move on from the events of 1936. The brothers were no longer divided simply by circumstance. They were divided by fundamentally different views of what had happened between them.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
The Second World War would cement the very different reputations of the two brothers. For George VI, the conflict became the defining chapter of his reign.
What George VI realised in World War II was that it was a conflict like Britain had never known before. It was a conflict which was going to be fought not just in terms of battlefields and across the world, but it was also going to be fought via the media. It was going to be fought in recorded speech, it was going to be fought in newsreels. It's very important that you had to look the right way, because every time that he was being filmed, it was something that was being distributed around the world. And a lot of Britain's allies, or putative allies, such as America, were looking at Britain, especially after the fall of France in 1940. The questions that they were asking are, do we let Britain stand alone? Do we let Britain fight on their own? Or do we actually try and help them? Is this worth our getting involved in?
Remaining in London during the Blitz, he and his family came to embody endurance, sacrifice, and national unity.
It was also the case that when the German Luftwaffe bombed Buckingham Palace, the royal household made much of this moment. Cameramen, journalists were invited into Buckingham Palace to survey the damage, to photograph it, and images emerged on the front page of newspapers of the king in amongst the rubble, in amongst the debris of Buckingham Palace, demonstrating that the king, he was also affected by what was going on.
Suddenly, it's not them and us, it's they are one of us. And George grew into his role as his popularity was cemented at this time.
The war transformed public perceptions of the king. Edward's experience was very different. Before the conflict, he and Wallis had visited Germany and met Adolf Hitler. Though the visit took place before war broke out, it would cast a long shadow over Edward's reputation.
He took a particular interest in the Nazi regime because he saw Hitler as a dynamic, charismatic leader, much like himself. When he'd been Prince of Wales and then King, he'd also been very impressed with what the Nazi Party had done in resolving Germany's unemployment crisis in the mid-1930s. He and Wallis travelled to Nazi Germany in 1937 and met with Adolf Hitler and leading Nazis as part of a short tour which encompassed visits to factories, to industrial sites. And again, Edward was very interested in looking at how it was that Germany had become this up-and-coming country once again under the auspices of the Nazi regime. Edward, like many people of his generation and class, was known to have held anti-Semitic views privately. And I think in that respect, there was some crossover with what was going on in Nazi Germany as well.
As Europe descended into conflict, questions continued to be raised about his judgment, his political views, and his attitude towards Nazi Germany.
Buckingham Palace was bombed on several occasions in World War II. The most spectacular one came relatively early in the war, when bombs landed sufficiently close to George VI and to Queen Elizabeth. So there was clearly somebody working off some kind of intelligence, which was not intelligence the general public would have had, and it's certainly not intelligence the Nazi Germany would have had. And the question that you have to ask is, how would you have got that intelligence were it not for the fact there was somebody who was at loose in Portugal at the time who would have been able to tell people exactly, if you wanted to bomb Buckingham Palace and kill my family, this is how you do it.
By 1945, the contrast between the brothers was stark. George emerged from the war respected and admired. Edward emerged more isolated than ever. The crisis that had begun with Wallis Simpson had evolved into something much deeper. Two brothers, once united by blood, now separated by duty, reputation, and an entirely different understanding of the monarchy itself.
Then the King and Queen appear for a great reception, with Princess Elizabeth, now 19, and Princess Margaret Rose, now 15 years old. Today, Britain, emerging from the war with a proud sense of duty well done, faces the grave problems of peace.
The Second World War, the relationship between George VI and the Duke of Windsor had been damaged almost beyond repair. The brothers remained in contact, but the warmth that had once defined their relationship was largely gone.
the war, Edward was more or less disgraced. It's important to remember that he wanted to come back to Britain and he wanted to live a life that was going to be the sort of life whereby he would be occupying a grand house somewhere and he would have a kind of informal court. He wants to go back to his and Wallis's Fort Belvedere. But the problem was that because of various revelations about precisely how hand in glove he'd been with the Nazi regime coming out in the Marburg files, it was enormously embarrassing that Edward should be let anywhere near the country.
For Edward, the sense of injustice never fully disappeared. He remained convinced that he and Wallis had been treated unfairly by the royal family and continued to feel excluded from the institution he had once led. George viewed matters differently. Having spent the war restoring confidence in the monarchy, he believed the stability of the crown had depended upon difficult decisions. The sacrifices demanded of him since 1936 had only reinforced his belief that duty had to come before personal wishes. The two brothers had never reconciled their competing versions of the past.
After the war, Edward and Wallis lived this sort of peripatetic life of moving between various homes in France, travelling to America. They lived the life of the gilded jet set, but with a laminated form of grief. It wasn't really the life that either of them wanted. And what was devastating for Edward was after he had been exiled and he tried to get back to his brother and kind of manipulate him and ask him for favours. It was Elizabeth who said, along with Tommy Lascelles, there can be no room for two kings in one country, and that if Edward swept into the country with all his charm and panache, he would overshadow his brother. So that was another huge bid to keep him away, to keep him out of the country.
As the years passed, George's health began to deteriorate. The pressures of kingship, combined with the strain of wartime leadership, had taken a heavy toll.
George VI became quite ill as a result of the Second World War. The stress of the conflict told on him. He was a heavy smoker, and by 1945, his health was actually very poor. In the ensuing years, that health would deteriorate. A number of smoking-related diseases would afflict the king to the extent where he would ultimately die prematurely in 1952.
It is with the greatest sorrow that we make the following announcement. It was announced from Sandringham at 10:45 today, February the 6th, 1952, that the king, who retired to rest last night in his usual health, passed peacefully away in his sleep early this morning.
His death marked the end of an extraordinary reign, one that had begun with his brother's abdication and carried Britain through some of the darkest years in its history. For Edward, it was the loss not only of a king, but of the brother with whom he had shared the defining events of his life.
The short message which I have to give you. The late king and I were very close, and the outstanding qualities of kingship he possessed made easier for me the passing on of the uninterrupted succession to the throne of the United Kingdom.
The crown now passed to George's eldest daughter, Elizabeth. At just 25 years old, Elizabeth II inherited a monarchy that had been profoundly shaped by the choices made in 1936. Her reign would be built upon many of the same principles her father had come to embody: duty, stability, and service. As the new queen established herself on the throne, Edward found himself increasingly distant from the centre of royal life. The man who had once been king became a figure from another era, his place in the royal story gradually receding into the background. Yet the consequences of the abdication never truly disappeared, leaving a legacy that would continue to shape the institution for generations to come. For decades after the abdication, the story of Edward VIII and George VI continued to divide opinion. In many ways, history came to judge the brothers through the choices they made at the moment their lives diverged. One chose personal happiness over obligation. The other accepted an obligation he had never wanted. Yet neither man escaped the consequences. Edward spent much of the rest of his life looking back on the events of 1936. Though he occasionally returned to Britain, he never regained a meaningful role within the monarchy and remained in many respects an outsider to the institution he had once led. Then, in May 1972, Edward died at the age of 77. More than 3 decades after the abdication, the man who had once been king was laid to rest on royal ground at Windsor. His death closed a remarkable chapter in royal history, but the questions raised by his decision did not disappear. The abdication transformed the course of the 20th century monarchy. It brought George VI to the throne, shaped the reign of Elizabeth II, and helped define modern expectations of what duty and service should mean within the royal family. Nearly a century later, the story of Edward and George remains one of the most consequential family dramas in British history. Two brothers raised in the same household, two very different men, and a decision that changed both their lives and the monarchy itself forever.